Well, thanks for to SAS for organizing this and giving us a chance to speak. I'm going to talk a little bit about delegate strategy, which I think has been an unreported aspect of the primary process in the media to this point. For the most part, who wins or loses a primary isn't that relevant, at least right now. The networks make a big deal about talking about when they can call a race for last night Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, but that's only determining who's going to win, and that, at least in this stage of the primary, doesn't have that much of an influence on the number of delegates that the candidates are accruing. And particularly in the Republican primary right now, you have a small but growing chance that no single candidate is going to be able to accrue the delegates that they would need to make it obvious that they'll secure the nomination at the Republican convention in July. And so moving forward, a really important aspect of voting and candidate strategy will be how do candidates maneuver in order to try to secure as many delegates as possible. So I'm going to focus primarily on the Republican side, and I'll have a couple of comments on the Democratic side. On the Republican side right now, candidates have to be very strategic about where they're deciding to campaign and how much effort they're going to expend. I think this is probably most prominent for candidates like John Kasich and Marco Rubio and Jeb Bush, who are competing over perhaps the same share of the Republican primary electorate, and also not in a position to necessarily compete in all of the southern states as well as Donald Trump and Ted Cruz are at this point in time. And I think, particularly for John Kasich, he faces a very interesting calculus today about, is he going to bother going to South Carolina at all? I think it's very unlikely that John Kasich would be able to perform particularly well in South Carolina. And when he's thinking about that, he's thinking about that from the perspective of the delegate allocation rule there, where South Carolina is one of the few states where what I said before doesn't really apply. Who wins the most votes is going to get most of the delegates. And this contrasts with states like Nevada or Virginia that are coming up, where they roughly use a PR system or proportional representation system to allocate delegates, so that roughly you're going to get a number of delegates equal to your vote share. And so what you're going to see in the upcoming weeks is these different Republican candidates with different goals, with different strengths in different states. With the upcoming primaries particularly being focused in the South, trying to figure out where should they campaign. And where should they campaign, particularly given that the media is going to potentially spin wins, losses, results as a function of expectations of the amount of effort they put into the state and so forth. And so what I'm really interested to see over the next few weeks is where these different candidates choose to allocate their time, how much they compete in different states. And I think why this is of particular interest to me is if you think that this is not going to be a foregone conclusion, that it's not going to be clear that, say, Trump or Cruz is going to get enough delegates, at some point it just becomes a scramble to see how many delegates you can get and try to get to the convention. And it's the case that once you're there, there's even more arcane rules that go into place about how long someone has to stay with the same candidate before a delegate can flip and things of the sort. And in my opinion, the candidate who's best positioned, at least as he's set out his campaign to take advantage of these rules, is Ted Cruz, who really has made a point of, when talking about the campaign, having this big strategy, a strategy that seems to really take a long time frame and be thinking about delegate accruement as one of his goals. And I think that Ted Cruz, especially relative to someone like Donald Trump, who's at least outward face on his campaign, doesn't seem to pay as much attention to some of these technicalities. If it ends up being one of these very closely contested nominations like we saw in 2008 between Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, I think Cruz is in a better position, much like Obama was in a better position then. I want to end very soon, but I want to say one quick thing about the Democratic nomination, which is this idea of superdelegates and how that plays a role. In the Republican primary, there aren't that many superdelegates. Superdelegates are party members who, as a function of their position in the party, get an additional say in terms of being a delegate at the national convention. And the Republican Party has a few superdelegates, but less so than the Democrats. And And I think this is going to be important moving forward because last night the story that you see on TV is that Sanders wins in a landslide. And in fact, that's what the vote returns show. But then you look at how many delegates did each candidate get in New Hampshire, and Clinton and Sanders are going to end up with roughly the same number of delegates. Why is that? Well, it's because the party elite in New Hampshire, these superdelegates, almost uniformly are behind Clinton. And so even though Sanders seems to have gained this resounding victory in terms of vote returns, and it's going to probably help him with momentum nationwide, it's not translating yet into the delegates that he's going to need to secure in order to really challenge Clinton for the nomination. So I'll stop there and welcome any questions about these topics or others in Q&A.
I guess the title of this panel is, what have we learned about Iowa and New Hampshire? I would say that we've learned very little about these results. And from a diversity perspective, we've learned absolutely nothing. Okay, let me be fair. We've learned something, but not that much. And let me explain why I initially said we've learned very little, especially in terms of diversity. If you look at the makeup of New Hampshire and Iowa, we have, 92% of white voters in Iowa, 94% roughly in New Hampshire. So the diversity of this nation is not being examined. And this is important for us to understand what will happen in the future. Can we make predictions about electoral outcomes based upon these two states and these two results? I think it's hard for us to do that. If you do consider the racial and ethnic minority diversity in this nation, I think the picture is going to change drastically over these next couple of elections. The next places we're heading to is, I think, Nevada, South Carolina. Keep in mind that in 2008, 50% of the voters in South Carolina that came out were African American. Then where do we go? Alabama, Arkansas, Georgia, Virginia, places where you have a high concentration of racial and ethnic minorities. African Americans favor Hillary Clinton 4-1 over Bernie Sanders. So I believe that Bernie Sanders' fortunes will change drastically as we move to other states and race becomes a bigger issue. Now, let's talk about the Republican side, because I think that's a tad bit more interesting. And I want to focus on Trump. Maybe a year ago, we could have done a SNL skit and it would have been hilarious about Donald Trump becoming president. Fast forward a year, and now that's a potential reality, that Donald Trump could be the president of the United States. I guess the reason why it is troubling, at least from a diversity perspective, is based upon the rhetoric that he has invoked, not just in this election, but before. Donald Trump has said that he does not want blacks handling his money. He said that he doesn't want Muslims coming to this nation, or we should put a ban on that, and that a lot of Mexicans that come over are rapists. I mean, that sort of xenophobic, potentially racist sort of thought process has problems, and it should be very troubling. Now, in terms of what we have learned, looking at a very homogeneous election in New Hampshire and Iowa, we've learned that his message that Donald Trump has put forth has resonated with some. And if it's resonating in places like Iowa and New Hampshire, we should be very much worried about that message resonating in places like South Carolina, Virginia, Georgia, Alabama, Arkansas, places that have had a contentious sort of relationship with race. So moving forward in the future, I think we want to keep a close eye on how these candidates address race and also how individuals vote based upon these race-related issues. Thank you.
It's great to be here. I'm really excited to talk to you guys a little bit about the primaries. So as Eileen mentioned, so I work on religion and politics. And so for me, the last two primaries have been particularly interesting because you have kind of two different extremes of religion in the US. On the one hand, you have Iowa, which is a very religious state, and in fact, 2/3 of the Republican caucus goers consider themselves to be evangelical Christians, which is kind of a loose coalition of various denominations that adhere to kind of conservative theology and the born-again experience and biblical literalism. New Hampshire, on the other hand, is one of the least religious states in the country. In fact, just yesterday I had said it was the second least religious state, but that was from polls a couple years ago. It used to be Vermont. New Hampshire actually took the cake. So in terms of surveys saying how religious are you and how often you go to church, New Hampshire is actually one of the least religious state in the country. And on the Republican side, 1 in 5, so about 20% rather than the 2/3 of the Republican delegates are evangelicals. So that's going to create a very different situation, and we might expect different outcomes, and we might expect to learn something about this going forward. So in Iowa, we saw Ted Cruz win. He ran a very textbook religious campaign, and it served him well. That being said, Santorum won Iowa in 2012, Huckabee won in 2028. These were the religious evangelical candidates. They did not go on to win the nomination, so we're going to stick a pin in that and come back to it. So this idea that religious voters matter certainly is true in Iowa, but then we go to New Hampshire, where religion is much less of an issue, or less important, and the evangelical makeup is much smaller. Ted Cruz, there have been people who have talked about the fact that Ted Cruz is maybe a little bit better of a candidate than Huckabee and Santorum. So despite the fact that he's running this religious campaign, Santorum and Huckabee before him really emphasized these social religious issues like gay marriage and abortion. Whereas Ted Cruz, while he talks about these, he's also taken more conservative stances on immigration and Obamacare and things that maybe appeal to the non-religious part of the Republican base. And that was a big issue that these previous kind of evangelical candidates didn't do so well. They didn't do well amongst the wealthy businessmen and the libertarian factions of the Republican Party. So in New Hampshire, that was kind of a testing ground for how well Cruz could do in a less religious environment. And in this case, he did fine. He came in 3rd place. He got 12%. So on the one hand, you could say, well, he's holding his own. But on the other hand, that's actually roughly the same as what Huckabee and Santorum got. They got between 10 and 11%, both of them. So in that case, you could actually make the case that he's not really doing a great job appealing and broadening his base. He's clearly not getting more of the vote than kind of this core evangelical group. So this also raises the question of whether or not Cruz is actually doing well, or he's doing well because there happens to be a very fractious Republican field right now. And so the fact that he did better than Rubio, Bush, and Christie, but together they made up 30% of the vote. So the fact that they actually did much, much better than him says something about his chances moving forward. And so the last thing I want to talk about relating to moving forward is whether or not we think religious voters may or may not be powerful in determining how Cruz does specifically and who the Republican nominee is going to be. And so for this, it's important to consider that while we have Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, always very early states, we actually have a fair amount of variation in when primaries are held. And this year, it's important to consider where evangelicals live in the country and when their primaries are. So in this case, 60% of the delegates, 65% of the delegates are going to be coming in these early states, and we know that early states matter because you have to do well in early states in order to be seen as viable, to get money, things like that. 65% of the delegates from these early states are coming from states that have more than 50% evangelical. So evangelicals are going to be quite overrepresented in states in the early part. They're going to be less represented in the later part, but this opens the door for Cruz, if he continues to do well among evangelical voters, in order to kind of continue to do well and potentially fundraise. This is going to potentially allow him in this long-term strategy to do well. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks. I'll build off some of the stuff that my colleagues talked about. I wanted to make kind of 2 broader points, echoing some of the things that they said. The first point is on the Republican side, and that's you can't beat something with nothing, right? And so if I'm not an establishment Republican, but if I was, I'd be trying to figure out how to defeat both Cruz and Trump, because I think there's pretty strong evidence they're likely to have a depressing effect on down ballot turnout, right, for Republicans who aren't running for the presidency. To say nothing of whether or not you think they're electable at the presidential level. I think they would both have pretty significant struggles. But the problem is that the Republicans can't really decide on who someone else should be. So here's a small difference that sort of flew below the radar, but it's, I think, sort of telling. So in the 10 days leading up to Iowa, a series of super PACs, most notably the one associated with Ted Cruz, which is Strengthen America First, I think. I think that's the main one with him. So they put $1.2 million in ads, all negative, all attacking Donald Trump. So that 70% of the ads that aired in Iowa in the week or the 10 days leading up to the primary were negative ads, right? So you have a lot of very targeted negative advertising right before the primary, largely directed, or basically entirely directed at Donald Trump. 0 such dollars were spent in New Hampshire, right? No one spent money attacking Trump, right, in the lead up to the primary. If you do that, Donald Trump wins, right? And the other kind of fascinating thing to me last night as I was watching, if you saw the very first thing Jeb Bush did after his press conference, after he gave his speech, right? He gave a press conference where, what did he do? He did not attack Donald Trump. He attacked John Kasich and Marco Rubio, right? He basically said Rubio is not experienced enough and Kasich has no path forward to the nomination, right? So if they, so I think basically what you're seeing there is a signal by, Jeb is trying to signal, I'm the only potential viable person, right? At this point, I think he doesn't even think he needs to mention Chris Christie, because I presume the I'm going home to New Jersey is just an elaborate way of saying I'm dropping out of the race. But, I mean, regardless of what you think of Chris Christie, it's pretty hard to spin like a 6th place finish as being particularly impressive. So, if the Republicans don't, sort of consolidate on someone, right, then the established, quote unquote, establishment people, and they all just attack each other. That strengthens the hand of. I used to think it just strengthened Trump, but increasingly, actually, if I were going to be, this is always very dangerous. If I were going to bet on this, and I thought that Republicans couldn't get on someone, I'm not completely convinced at that point yet, but if I thought that's where it was headed, I actually think that gives a stronger hand actually to Ted Cruz. Because while establishment Republicans all seem to intensely dislike Ted Cruz, so there have been all these stories, if you read like the New York Times or Washington Post, basically that every single, like no one who serves in the Senate with him has been willing to endorse him. No one from Texas has been willing to endorse him, right? Basically anyone that seems to have ever met, encountered, or had even the slightest dealing with him has been willing to endorse him. I could see him using that as sort of a way forward. And my guess is that party elites don't want to appear too heavy-handed, right, for fear of kind of, angering people and seeing as coordinating someone, but there's a real danger, I guess, this is an illustration of parties as collective action problems, that it's clear that the leaders don't like Cruz and Trump, but if they don't coalesce around someone reasonably soon, it's going to make their task a lot harder. Point 2. So I want to suggest that both Senator Sanders and Secretary Clinton both have some big advantages and disadvantages. We've heard a lot in the last few days about the disadvantages of Secretary Clinton. So I thought I'd talk just for what I see as sort of the 2 significant hurdles that Senator Sanders faces. So building off the point that Daniel made, right, it's certainly true that Secretary Clinton's support is much stronger among racial and ethnic minorities. But there's 2 points worth underlining that on that point in a little bit more detail. One, the Democratic Party is now slightly over, or if you believe survey evidence, slightly over 40% non-white, right? So that nearly half of the people who identify as Democrats are not white, and we don't really think Senator Sanders has done particularly well among racial and ethnic minorities. Now, if you've seen the line from Cornel West, his argument is just that African Americans, Latinos, Asians just need to get to know Bernie Sanders better, and then they'll embrace him. But I'm more skeptical of that, as much as I respect Professor West. Second, right, the 2 states where Bernie Sanders won are 2 of the 3 states where white liberals, based on exit polls, make up a majority of the electorate. The 3rd state is Vermont, which Secretary Clinton was never going to seriously contest anyway, in awards like 0, not 0, but it's a very small number of delegates, right? So it's not really worth very much. Which is to suggest that in order for Senator Sanders to win, he actually has a pretty uphill climb, and that he's got to do better among racial and ethnic minorities, and he's got to start doing better among moderates and conservatives. Now, the exit polls in New Hampshire maybe give him slightly more reason for encouragement on the latter thing. So if you saw, he actually won moderates as well. He won liberals overwhelmingly, and somewhat less convincingly won moderates. Whether that continues into the future remains to be seen. The second point I would just make very quickly on this. Oh, one more point on that first thing. If you looked at the breakdown in New Hampshire, almost all of the Sanders win comes from the fact that independents it's a so-called open primary state, so that someone who's an independent can vote in the Democratic or the Republican primary, but not both. So Sanders wins people who are independents by something like 20 points. They actually tie among registered Democrats. A bunch of the states we're leading into are so-called closed primary states where only Democrats can win, which makes it more complicated for him. The other problem, I think, for Senator Sanders is that only 1% of Americans view economic inequality as our most important concern. And even more problematic for him is that there's not really much evidence that talking to people about inequality makes them want to engage in more redistribution. So while there is certainly a constituency for that among the sort of people that Senator Sanders has already appealed to, more broadly, I think that's going to be a tougher sell among the American public writ large.
Does Trump have any strategy to court the minority vote? And if he doesn't, does he think he can win without it?
I think he does have a strategy to court the minority vote. I think that his appeal to racial and ethnic minorities it has drastically changed over his campaign. He's even been able to court some black Republicans to endorse him. I think he's trying to make greater appeals to Latinos, trying to improve his perception on immigration. So I think that his approach is to engage in more rhetoric that's favorable towards racial and ethnic minority community. That being said, I think that he can win without the racial and ethnic minority vote. I think he's going to need some of the vote from the Latino community, but in terms of the black vote, African Americans vote heavily towards the Democratic side. I want to say for Obama, last time around, it was over 92% or something like this. It was a very high percentage. So while he'll make these sort of favorable statements that will be, I think, in contradiction to what he said in the past, he's not relying on these statements to win over a significant number of minorities to win any of the elections.
I would add one more thing onto that, which is, I think Daniel's absolutely right that you don't, if you're a Republican candidate, don't have to get a lot of minority votes to potentially win. I think the risk that Trump faces is that he will mobilize the turnout in those communities to show up in November if he is the candidate on the ballot. And so I think a lot of the rhetoric that Daniel's talking about is not designed necessarily to win these votes, but to try to not come across as bad as to become the reason why people are showing up to vote, even if they aren't supporters of either Clinton, Sanders, or whoever the Democratic candidate is.
And the last point I'll make about that, absolutely, Marc, that sort of the effect that he can have on mobilizing the minority community is absolutely true. So another point I want to make on this is that I don't think Donald Trump has had to seriously sit down and engage in a debate about some of the statements that he has made. So you make a statement like you don't want Muslims coming into this nation, you have to explain that. Are you talking about ethnic Muslims? Are you talking about religious Muslims? I mean, you got to go through the specifics. Exactly what are you referring to? Talking about black Muslims? What exactly is going on? And when he has, I think, to sit down, when he had to sit down and explain his statements that sometimes seem offensive, I think he's going to ostracize not only the minority community, but he might also ostracize non-minorities as well. So.
Thanks. I have some more questions about superdelegates. I hope either that they're not too simple or too complicated. How many superdelegates are there? And assuming that they've all or mostly committed to Hillary Clinton, does Bernie Sanders have a chance, or how many states would he have to win in order to overcome her superdelegate majority? And it's one vote per superdelegate, is that right? Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so every sitting, I believe it's Democratic Congress person, senator, and governor, plus a few other people who are superdelegates. I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but let's say they make up somewhere between 10 and 20% of all delegates. Currently, Senator Clinton has won over roughly 80 to 90% of those who have pledged support to someone. I think that one thing to note about that statement is superdelegates aren't bound to vote for someone just because they've pledged support to them. And so you saw in 2008 that there were a number of people who initially supported Hillary Clinton who moved over the course of the campaign. And so I think part of the Sanders campaign strategy has to be to win some of these superdelegates over and try to at least minimize the deficit he faces as a result of those superdelegates. And if he goes on and is winning primaries after primary, it's going to be harder for the superdelegates from those states to face their constituents and say, it turns out, I'm going to support the person that you don't want. So I think that is definitely part of the broader Sanders strategy, is to try to become seen as the winner, so as to try to win over some of those superdelegates to his camp.
If Michael Bloomberg should enter the race, who does it have the greatest effect on, either positively or negatively, the Republicans or the Democrats?
Yeah, I mean, so as Michele just said, it depends on who the nominee is. I mean, I never know what to, I'm always skeptical of these stories that say unnamed sources say, because those unnamed sources almost always have some other agenda, right? So they claim that he will only get in if it's Cruz/Trump versus Sanders, right? In that case, really hard to tell. Maybe he hurts the Republicans more, but that's like really big if. I mean, I think the bigger issue is that it will highlight if he. I'm skeptical of the claim that he will get in, even as rich as he is. It takes a very big infrastructure to run for president, right? If you don't have the party doing this for you, like you have to have lots of people, just getting you ballot access in every state, and that's a state-by-state fight. It takes a lot of time, a lot of labor, a lot of money. If you don't have a party infrastructure to do lots of things for you, it's just phenomenally expensive and just really difficult. So I'm not sure why, even if you had, for all intents and purposes, unlimited funds, you would choose to spend them that way.
One thing I'd add is, you'll see in the media trial polls where they'll present a poll if Trump ran against Sanders, and then a three-way poll with all three included. And I think you have to be very cautious about interpreting those as the effect of Bloomberg's entry right now, because these people haven't formed perceptions of these candidates yet. We're in this room because probably most of us are really interested in politics, so we've thought through this. But you can rarely overestimate how much the average American voter knows about politics. Most people have heard the name Bernie Sanders. They know that Donald Trump has said some things and is in business, but they don't know the specifics yet. And so be very cautious about seeing a poll right now that's running trial heats and interpreting that as, that's the effect of Bloomberg.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing I would say, very consistent with what Marc said, is that people, when they do this sort of thing now, they're like, yes, I know I don't like Trump, and I don't know that Sanders is a socialist, that kind of scares me. So Bloomberg, yes, that seems like a sensible guy. So people can kind of read their hopes and wishes into, someone like Michael Bloomberg and say, oh, he seems like a reasonable centrist guy, right? So I like him, right? Even if they don't necessarily, but if you then said to them, well, what does he actually stand for? Most people wouldn't really be able to tell you very much.
Good afternoon. I would like to know, what do you think Senator Clinton will have to do to galvanize particularly the young vote? And do you think, and I'm speaking to the African American professor, do you think that African Americans, particularly from the age bracket of 50 and beyond, will remember some of the gavels or blunders that were made during Obama campaign with her husband, and she made some really egregious comments?
I think that they will remember some of that, but I believe if it's a race between, so to answer the second part of your question first, if it is a race between Hillary Clinton versus, let's say, Trump or someone else, Obama will come out and hit the campaign stump for Hillary Clinton. And I think some of the negative things that she might have said will fade away. In addition to that, once Bill Clinton comes out there, I think the affinity that the African American community has for Bill Clinton will be a major boost for Hillary. You know, he gets out there, starts to, say a couple of things, and, he gets the crowd going, and I think that's gonna play to her favor. So I believe that she will be able to galvanize the Black community in a positive way. But this also, I think part of this question goes back to a previous question. If you're looking at Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump, if that is the race at the end of the day, then, who would you want? You want Donald Trump, or do you want the first woman married to, many say, the first Black president? I think that they would go with Clinton. I think that will mobilize them. I don't. Well, I do believe that Bernie Sanders is making major headways with young people on a whole. But I also think that if you look at the minority community, the major issues for young people is the Black Lives Matter and the police brutality and these sort of things. You see, for any of you who saw the Super Bowl, you saw Beyonce out doing her thing, wonderful show, had to get tickets for her tour. But there's this major sort of contention about that. She's celebrating the Black Panther Party anniversary and talking about racial issues in her recent video. She gets that pushback. But it is this aspect of race that the younger people are embracing and saying, hey, someone should be saying things about this. And I believe as Hillary Clinton begins to campaign in South Carolina, Alabama, Arkansas, Georgia, she will be forced to address these issues head on. And I think she has a good background to do that. Bernie Sanders, I think less so. I don't know if individuals can relate, especially younger individuals, especially racial ethnic minorities, can relate to Bernie Sanders in the same way because that history just isn't there. Bernie Sanders hasn't been a major advocate for public policies dealing with racial and ethnic minorities. And so for younger people, I think he would have to struggle a little more than Hillary Clinton would.
Yeah, if I can just add to talk about the first part, or one quick thing on following up what Daniel said, and then one thing on the youth vote. It's not by accident that if you look at where Mrs. Clinton or Secretary Clinton spent the weekend, it was in Flint, right, doing a bunch of things there. That had nothing to do with New Hampshire. That had everything to do with South Carolina and the so-called SEC primary, right, that's going to take place on March 1st. That was very much a move to try and galvanize minority and particularly African-American supporters. And second thing I'd say about the youth vote is, I'll apologize in advance for this to those of you who are still in the youth vote. So those of us here are not, as you might be able to tell. There, Michele more so than the rest of us. Exactly. Young people just don't turn out very much. I'm sorry, that's just kind of the brutal reality that, if you look, traditionally young people, that's those ages 18 to 29, have made up somewhere between 16 and 17% of the electorate. If you sort of look at the sort of share of it in November, In 2008, even the vaulted kind of Obama bringing up young people, it did go up. It's true, and went up to just under 17%. So it's that old people vote and young people don't. So it's a lot more important to make sure that you get people who are like 35 and older, right? Especially like 45 and older to the polls. Great if you can get some young people there, but that's less. It just in the end, it's everything we know tells us that's less likely to be consequential.
Hi, how you doing? In his responses to questions about religion and spirituality in the recent town halls and debates, Sanders has generally kind of purported a non-deistic view of spirituality and religion. How significant is it that we have a potential front runner who is kind of able to admit that, I guess, on stage? And obviously, I'm not purporting to know about his religious affiliation, but
so that's a great question. So I actually would turn that on its head. That's a new thing that he said that, this idea of being, I'm spiritual, I'm not religious. Before, he was just kind of a secular atheist Jew, and that he actively would say he didn't really believe in God. And so that gets back to, so there's frequently Pew asks questions about, would you vote for a black man for president, and a gay person for president, a woman for president, and they ask for religions as well. And and asking if you'd vote for an atheist president is far and away the lowest levels of support, below like a Muslim president, below any and all racial and ethnic minorities. And so I don't know how much it would matter in a Democratic primary sense. Obviously, most Democrats, even though they're the less religious party, are still religious identifiers and belong to a religious faith. If I had to make a guess, I would say that was Bernie Sanders maybe looking down the line, that you don't want to be this, you don't want to be someone who never talks about religion, thought of as sort of an atheist, and then if he does win the nomination, then he'd have to completely switch gears. So by kind of talking about his faith now, I was really surprised about that when I saw it, because that sort of stands against everything that he's had his entire career up until this point, or at least his public life. But I think he realizes that is going to be something that gets him in trouble down the line.
You were talking before about inroads that Bernie Sanders needs to make with minority voters, and how he's like at such a disadvantage right now, and how like that could be attributed to lack of name recognition, but that's kind of, you don't think that's as large of a component as a lot of other people are kind of pushing. So I wanted to ask, are there like, what do you think the deeper, what are the deeper reasons for his like inability to make inroads with minority voters? Is it like part of his voting record, or is it more recent events? If you could speak to that. And also, like, what kind of like role will momentum play leading up into these next two coming primaries in the next couple of weeks?
I would say that it's more Hillary than Bernie Sanders. And I don't, when I sort of survey young people's perspectives on Bernie Sanders, I don't think anyone is really pushing back against what he's saying, his message. I mean, it seems to be all good stuff. But I think it's looking at him relative to Hillary Clinton. And I feel that individuals are just more motivated and inspired by some of the things that Hillary Clinton stands for. Becoming the first woman president, I think it's a great thing. Hillary Clinton's ability to engage back and forth with the Black Lives Matter movement. If you recall, when the Black Lives Matter movement disrupted Bernie Sanders, it's like they shut down this whole event, and then he sort of exit stage left and then sort of engaged with them. When the Black Lives Matter movement interrupted Hillary Clinton's event, she engaged with them and talked to them a little. Hillary Clinton also has been visiting a lot of black churches and talking to them, engaging with them. In addition to that, the younger generation they're being influenced by their parents. And the parents, they recognize the Clinton name brand and what Clinton has done for the minority community. And they are having an effect and influencing, I think, their children. And so I'm less likely to say that Bernie Sanders is putting forth this negative message or is doing things that the minority community, especially minority youth, don't like. Rather, I'll say that Hillary Clinton just has, the minority community is so much more familiar with what Hillary Clinton has done. And so that's why it's going to be an uphill battle for Bernie Sanders moving forward. I'm sorry? If I'm being honest, yes. I don't think, I mean, if you were to fast forward a couple of months now and tell me that Bernie Sanders is able to acquire the majority of the minority vote, whether you're talking about older generation or younger generation, I would be blown away by that. I think something substantial would have to, will have to happen. No, I don't even think it's possible. I mean, Hillary Clinton could, she's, in the minority community, her and Bill are like the Teflon presidents and candidates when it comes down to racial and ethnic minorities.
I'm going to add one thing on to what Daniel said, which is the Sanders campaign faces a tension that its central message is sort of rejecting the Obama administration. It's not outright rejecting the Obama administration, but it's certainly not embracing the Obama administration. I think you saw a pretty tactically shrewd move by Hillary Clinton roughly 6 weeks ago to be much more vocal in her support for the Obama agenda and the Obama administration more broadly. And so I think that, I don't necessarily agree with Daniel that it's insurmountable, but I think that is an additional barrier that Sanders is going to have to face and walk a really tight line of still getting out his central message, which is in some ways a rejection of some of, or at least saying that that Obama didn't go far enough on a number of policy areas without pushing away the minority community whose approval of Obama has been over 85% his entire administration. So I think how Sanders deals with that tension is going to play a big role in determining his success with the minority community more broadly.
Yeah, I mean, to follow up on what Marc said, you actually saw a fantastic example of this last night in his victory speech when he said, now, what President Obama has done is a good start, right? And then he goes on to say, like, here's all the other things, you know, we have to do, right? But it really does, as I was watching it, I thought, oh, it's you know, threading the needle in a pretty, you know, particular, very particular sort of way that's going to be a challenge.
I'll also say that if I was advising Bernie Sanders, I would tell him to focus more on the Latino community, trying to court that vote and trying to mobilize them to get them out to vote. Right now, Latinos constitute around 16 to 17% of the nation. They are the largest racial and ethnic minority group here. You know, various scholars refer to them as the sleeping giant. And so if he's looking to court the minority vote, he would have a better chance going there than trying to change the 4-to-1, as I've said earlier. That's the advantage that Hillary has over Bernie Sanders for African Americans. He have a harder time trying to change that sort of statistic.
Hello. If you had to bet on the Republican nominee that wins, just for each of you, which one would you pick and why?
So it turns out you're asking a question that is the most frequent subject of debate at the political science lunch table. So we have many stated bets and non-stated bets already on this. Our former graduate student at Penn, David Rothschild, has this website set up called PredictWise, which I recommend if people are looking for what people are actually betting on that they can check out. PredictWise currently puts Trump as the favorite, Rubio as the second favorite, and Cruz as the third favorite. I mean, it's hard to disagree with that ordering. I will say that I personally think Cruz is being underappreciated in those betting markets, and that I think that he, well, I do think he's the third favorite. I don't think he's as far behind Trump and Rubio as some of the other people who are betting are saying.
I would say Trump, and I have already bet on Trump with some of my colleagues that he wins it. The reason why is I believe that you know, not only in terms of race and ethnicity, but in terms of the economy and all these other things, terrorism, Trump engages in some harsh rhetoric, and there are times where what he says sort of invokes this eagle soars about America, this ability for us to be the top dog and to not tolerate failure, and that sort of message sometimes resonates with individuals. Even if we're not looking at this, like, as I said before, through racial terms, I think that many people are yearning for that. They're also yearning for this straight talk. Say what you will, as I have, about the rhetoric being offensive. He's willing to say it. And, speaking about this anti-establishment, very few people are able to do that. And he doesn't care. He's able to do it. He doesn't get any sort of pushback by it. And he's been receiving votes as a result of this. In addition to that, he is, for the most part, funding his own campaign. So people feel as though he's not being influenced by lobbyists and by money. He has his own money. He can make it happen. And I think that's another component of why individuals like him. And then finally, the racial and ethnic dimension. When he makes some of these statements, especially when he made the statements about whether or not we should allow Muslims to enter into this nation, there is a growing segment of society that feels the way Donald Trump does. They won't say it in day-to-day conversations or what have you, but they can express it through their votes. And I think that segment of the American society will shine through, and I believe that he will be the candidate for the Republican Party.
So in August, I placed my money on Rubio. So I was feeling pretty cocky after Iowa, because I was like, see, everyone was underestimating him. I'm feeling a little less cocky today, but I still think that it's probably going to be Rubio. I think that he has the infrastructure in place to become the establishment candidate. That said, I completely agree with Marc and everything from my initial remarks. I think Cruz is underrated. I think especially as someone who draws on religious voters and where the primaries are that are early, and the fact that he has a strategy for this sort of long fight. I don't know if it's just wishful thinking. I really don't see Trump getting the nomination. But so anyway, so my money's still on Rubio, but I think Cruz is the underdog in my book.
Yeah, I mean, if forced to make a choice, my thinking would break down, not unlike Michele's, that I suspect, if Rubio can, at some point, if you're going to be the front runner, you need to actually win. If he can, sort of give a convincing win somewhere, I think that goes a long way to establishing his credibility. That said, if it comes down to a slog, I give the edge to Cruz over Trump, even if Trump's more popular, because Cruz's people are much more savvy about the way in which they have gone about, planning out delegates, figuring out how to get people to knock on doors, building a political infrastructure, which is something that Trump has not done nearly as well.
I'll add one more thing, which is if I was betting on the actual PredictWise right now, you can buy Mitt Romney at 100-to-1 odds. I like those odds.
Can you talk a little bit about Super Tuesday? Will that be a major factor in terms of winnowing out the herd, or is it basically we're just going to be slogging along all the way to the convention?
So one really interesting thing about Super Tuesday, as opposed to what follows, is the Republicans, with the exception of South Carolina, have said you can't use a winner-take-all system to allocate your delegates. And so what that means is that it doesn't just matter who's winning, but also people's relative standing. So to give one example, in Alabama, I think it is, a candidate needs to get over 20%, but as long as they get over 20%, they'll roughly split the delegates equally. And so I think the important thing that will be established by Super Tuesday is, I agree with Michele, it's likely to be Marco Rubio, but whoever that person is, can that person reach the thresholds necessary to get delegates? If it's the case that an establishment candidate is doing well enough and people have coordinated enough to get them above these thresholds, I think coming out of Super Tuesday, whoever that person is will have a good chance to become the focal point for the Republican Party. If, though, we're in the current state of chaos where there is no coordination and people aren't attacking Donald Trump, but it's Bush and Rubio and Kasich and Christie attacking each other, I think we won't have the same resolve coming out of Super Tuesday. So I think what I'd be looking for is, do we reach a state where there is enough coordination on an establishment candidate or not? And I think that will determine a lot about how much clarity comes from it.
Yeah, I mean, the other interesting dynamic that'll happen is after Super Tuesday 2 on the 15th, or no, I guess we need some other name for it now. There is, I think, one more primary in March after that, but then we take something like 3.5 weeks off until the set of primaries that happen in sort of mid to late April, when Pennsylvania will be among the states voting. That could potentially, I mean, especially if, as Marc pointed out, we still are in this situation with multiple candidates, that really changes things, right? Because now we have this we're sort of back to a pre-Iowa world where it's like, oh, we just have media attention where they're just attacking each other, but no one's really campaigning or voting. So it's unclear kind of how people are winning and losing. I mean, it's just a new, the way the party shifted the race. I mean, I think the Republicans did this because they're like, we're in a nice, easy, race. We're going to have this all wrapped up by mid-March, and then we're going to have this break, and then the rest of the primaries won't matter very much. So much for wishful thinking. So that, I honestly have no idea what'll happen, in this month where no one votes, but there's still going to be a lot of media attention to it.
I wonder if you're willing to lay odds on having the Republican convention go past the first ballot, that nobody comes out of the primary system, right, with enough delegates behind them. And then we're talking about the preferences of delegates instead of voters, and how does that change your view of what might happen?
I mean, I would say 20% chance right now, and I think if we exit Super Tuesday in a scenario where there's 4 more candidates gaining delegates, I think that increases the odds even more. It's not just the case that the delegates have free reign to do whatever they want. There's actually a very complicated set of instructions that delegates have about the process through which they vote. So I'm not sure it's that easy to say before knowing how all the results shake out who would benefit, but there's clearly an advantage once you're in the convention, if we're in a situation like this, to whatever candidate the party establishment wants. I think they'll be able to maneuver around somewhat to help shape an agenda or other things that may benefit the establishment candidate. And so I think if you end up in a situation where no one has enough delegates, this is where a candidate like Rubio or Kasich or Bush would be at an advantage. And I think that's actually probably the long game strategy for a candidate like Bush or Kasich right now is I don't see any path forward where they get a majority of delegates, but I do see a path forward where they have a large number of delegates and then they are in a situation where the party hasn't been able to pick a nominee yet.
Thank you. I appreciate that.